advocacy have become suspect. And let me give you a couple of examples in the context of demonizing dissent. On the environmental side, organizations like the Sierra Club, David Suzuki Foundation, and Tides Canada have been variously described as eco-terrorists or organizations working against the interests of Canadians, and these pronouncements have come ex cathedra from the Minister's office. In the case of the HIV/AIDS legal network, federal funding was cut in the last several months on the ground of activism, potential activism, or worse, the threat that they might engage in human rights. And this coming directly from a letter that was directed at the executive director of the HIV/AIDS legal network. The federal government, once again, has made these downs advocacy and activism, once the bedrock of any democracy that aspires to that name, to become dirty words. Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care, an association of medical doctors protesting the defunding of medical care and other health services for refugees, have been accused by the government as being liars, dissemblers, and worse, activists. When they reported publicly the impact of health funding cuts on refugees who are ill, men, women, and children, following the partial elimination of the interim federal health program. Among these lying, dissembling activists is the head of Family and Community Medicine at St. Mike's, Dr. Berger. The second plank, defunding democracy. The connection between leveling the playing field, democracy, capacity of NGOs, and the rule of law is a fundamental one, and one that's becoming increasingly clear but increasingly difficult to mobilize, in part because the language around freedom has become a language associated with individual ability to act, if not a kind of more anarchical approach to it, rather than understanding that freedom actually requires, in this day and age, resources. If you strip away the capacity of organizations to build websites, publish materials, hire counsel, etc., and just allow them to go to your equivalent of Hyde's Park or Hyde's Corner and scream on the street, I can assure you that very few messages are actually going to get through anywhere. So defunding democracy is built on the premise that if social movements are indeed democracy by another name, then we, I would suggest to you, are losing ours. In Canada, since the 1970s, the nonprofit sector has relied on three principal sources of funding. First has been access to charitable status, which confers important tax benefits. We do not have the wealth in this country or the philanthropic base of our neighbors to the south. Historically, NGOs in this country have relied on government, charitable status, and to a lesser extent, union funding. Let's look at what's happening to all three. When organizations like Tides and the organizations I mentioned earlier, Suzuki, etc., began speaking out against the oil sands project, an organization that is fronted by a couple of people you've never heard of, but is backed by Ezra Levant, along with a number of other right-wing organizations, found the wherewithal to get a law firm that they retained to write a 114-page letter to the Canada Revenue Agency in order to encourage them to strip charitable status from Tides Canada, mentioning 2 to 3 other environmental organizations as well. You have to note, by the way, that conservative organizations like the Fraser Institute and the Montreal Economic Institute, which are all about advocacy and public policy, have not been touched. The second source of government, if you don't get charitable funding, of course, is the government itself. And once again, the partnership between government and the nonprofit sector, which has been a historic way of delivering services, is also being stripped away. Women's groups that are engaged in research, advocacy, pay equity, and international development have lost significant parts of their funding. This is due in part to the change in rules of Status of Women Canada, because research policy, particularly related to equity and equality, are no longer being funded. This is a partial list that you see up of only a fraction of the organizations that we've currently documented: Aboriginal Healing Foundation, Afghan Association of Ontario, Alternatives, Canada Without Poverty, Canada Arab Foundation, Canada, CCIC, Canadian Council on Learning, Doctors for Refugee Care, etc., etc., etc. Cuts from CEDA and other government departments have crippled organizations, including Kairos, Alternatives, and the organizations I mentioned earlier. The other shoe dropped recently, mentioned earlier by another speaker, with the announced new policy directions at CEDA, whereby private sector partnerships were announced as the new stuff that will fill the vacuum left by the nonprofits that are quickly sliding into the ocean. Not necessarily this one, but certainly an ocean somewhere. The Centre for Rights and Equality and Accommodation, one of Ontario's leading organizations dealing with accommodation rights, the right to housing, has had its funding cut. The Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action, well represented in this room, has also seen its funding reduced. So this pincer movement, if I could use the military term, of combined loss or threatened loss of charitable status on the one hand and cut support from the government on the other, is having a major impact on civil society in this country. And most recently, of course, the third shoe, as it were, has dropped, and that is the result of Bill 337, which some of you may be aware is the federal legislation that is imposing significant new reporting requirements on the labor movement, including reports on any organization that they fund when they've given them more than $5,000. The argument, of course, is that this is part of the quid pro quo of the benefits the labor movement gets for its recognition by the federal government, including some tax advantages. The problem with it, of course, is that it's a significant violation of the Constitution Act, which places almost all labor matters, with a few exceptions, in the provincial sphere. Hopefully this is one area where Quebec's fierce defense of its provincial jurisdiction might come in useful. The third plank is democratic institutions. Now, last year, 7 independent parliamentary institutions, and agents, including former Auditor General Sheila Fraser, complained publicly that their work was being completely ignored. Kevin Page, of course, has been in this camp as well, but there are many worse things than being ignored. Outspoken heads of important oversight bodies have been fired and sidelined when their messages have become controversial or inconvenient. Paul Kennedy removed as the head of the Commission for Public Complaints. RCMP Chief Superintendent Martin Cheliak, who headed the Canadian Firearms Program, such as it was removed from his functions. Linda Keane, Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Muneer Sheikh resigned as the StatsCan head following the knowing misrepresentation of his position to the Canadian people by a minister of the government. 2012, Canada's high-profile chief economic analyst, Phil Cross, also resigned, saying that internal debate in StatsCan had made it impossible to address issues of statistical reliability and robustness. And of course, the Veterans Ombudsman, Pat Stogren, also fired for being a strong advocate for veterans. Well, why should all of you as activists care about Statistics Canada? The reason you should care about Statistics Canada is because all of the work Statistics Canada does is the most robust data and information that's available internationally to track the progressive realization of rights on all economic, social, and cultural fronts. That's why you should care. And with the loss of that data, we've lost our ability to know what's going on. It is not enough to say that we are going to have voluntary census information, because the recent voluntary census information has demonstrated a lower level of reliability, i.e. 70% returns, than is required in order to make sure that the data received is indeed reliable. And let us not forget rights and democracy. Left in tatters after what some commentators described as a hostile takeover and the tragic death of Remy Beauregard in January 2010, it limped along for a further 2 years in a spectacular parade of bureaucratic bungling, incompetence, and thousands of dollars spent in vain trying to find something, anything, to tarnish Beauregard's reputation after his death at government and public expense. The organization was left in tatters and put out of its and our collective misery by the Harper government in April 2012. The next plank is human rights. This is the 30th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and you would never know it. This government has done absolutely nothing to signal, commemorate, or fund any activities with regard to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, preferring to emphasize the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights in 1960, which, although it was important for historical reasons, is generally viewed from a legal standpoint as being an abject failure. There's been a full-on assault against human rights commissions in this country. Well, in this province, of course, there isn't one, but never mind. And they're staffed not only by right-wing bloggers gone ballistic, but also legislatures and public pundits. Critics have questioned the role or even the need for human rights infrastructure in this country. In 2009, Kenneth Roth, the head of Human Rights Watch at the international level, told a Montreal audience that Canada's international foreign policy record had declined in stature. Our standing in the Global Integrity Report dropped in 2010, largely as a result of weaker accountability and conflict of interest factors, and in 2011, Amnesty International brought up the rear by releasing a report urging Canada to get back on track. I've mentioned attacks on knowledge, research, and data, and I just want to give you an overview of why this matters and how important it is. Much of the public infrastructure that is linked to knowledge, research, and data, in addition to the statistical information I mentioned a moment ago, is fundamental in order to make sure that there are balances of power in terms of our parliamentary democracy, and to make sure that independent agents, of course Sheila Fraser, formerly the Auditor General of Canada, being one of the best known examples, but there are many others, including some of the ones I mentioned earlier. The Law Commission of Canada has disappeared again. Canadian Policy Research Networks, one of Canada's leading nonpartisan think tanks that was created by Judith Maxwell, a name that I hope many of you would recognize, closed its doors in 2009. The Canadian Council for Learning is gone. We talked about the long-form census. NRT, the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, is gone. The National Council of Welfare is gone. The First Nations Statistic Institute was chopped in 2012. The Sisters in Spirit documentation project mentioned earlier, which had documented missing and murdered women, I know a topic very current right now in this province, is also gone. Sisters in Spirit, of course, continues to exist, but the documentation project the money's been sucked out of it and given to the RCMP. Without good research, policy is overtaken by what Daniel Kahneman would call the fast thinking of impression, cognitive ease, and intuition. The federal government's omnibus bill, Bill C-10, from a couple of years ago, the Safe Streets and Communities Act, I love the names of their legislation, is a prime example. Despite a consistently high measure of Canadians who do feel that criminals get inadequate sentencing, mandatory minimum sentencing frameworks do not work. They are demonstrated to have failed in the United Kingdom, they are demonstrated to have failed in the United States, and experts have predicted that Bill C-10 will fail the needs of the fastest growing prison populations in Canada, women with mental disabilities, and Aboriginal persons. The result of all of this, as one researcher recently put it, and I wish I'd said it, is a shift from evidence-based policymaking to decision-based evidence-making. Environmental data, as I mentioned earlier, is disappearing fast, and the huge cuts in Environment Canada and in major research institutions are slowly shuttering many Canadian leading research and data institutions, including the Environmental Lakes area. How many of you heard of the Environmental Lakes area? Oh, you don't count. So, good. Having heard of these organizations, the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, another one. NRT, another one, and so on. The result of all of this, collectively, is a loss of reliable and robust data about the state of Canadian society. This all has a direct implication for equality rights, the rights of vulnerable communities in Canada, since it is now much more difficult to meet our international requirements to provide evidence of the progressive realization of economic, social, and cultural rights, and I would even argue the positive obligations that are starting to increase on governments with regard to the respect of civil and political rights, without reliable and robust data that would have been offered by not only a mandatory census, but all of the collective information that we're in the process of losing. Last year, the Government of Canada also cut about 30% of the budget from Libraries and Archives Canada, resulting in the shutting down of many of the major libraries of the federal government of Canada, and the grey literature that is kept within major government departments, including Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission of Canada, are being eliminated. Nobody knows where that data is going, and the digitization projects that are going to transfer that information into safe, secure, and accessible sites, nobody knows what's happened to them yet. So, in cheerful conclusion, a healthy respect for human rights depends on a lot of things. Many of you in this room will well understand that it is not only about human rights, the rule of law, democratic governance, robust civil societies, or the political will to sustain the institutions that protect them. It's about all these things. And it's about all these things working together. And these critical ingredients are nourished by an independent, informed, and balanced media, by governments that both understand and champion rights. And if dissent is indeed under attack, if opposition is indeed being silenced, and if civil society is indeed under the siege that I described today, then democracy in all of its modern aspects is quite literally in peril in this country. Obviously, the United Nations and organizations that I work with don't spend a lot of time worrying about the state of democracy in Canada. They have more important things to worry about. I worked in a lot of these countries and I understand it. But if countries like Canada, that are supposed to be providing the support for the UN and for other international organizations, itself is experiencing a significant rollback of rights, then we have to ask ourselves, what is it going to take for Canadians to mobilize? The work that I described today in the documentation project is a valuable, although obviously disturbing, online compendium of the rapidly growing number of instances of individuals, groups, and public servants who've been punished or singled out because of their advocacy and dissent. Voices recently submitted a report to the Universal Periodic Review on what I just described to you in anticipation of Canada's upcoming review in February 2013. And although we all have our different perspectives, I hope that we all stand for a Canada where different voices, diverse voices, need to be nourished, nurtured, and encouraged as part of a country where participation and civil society are enabled and not disabled. Not only as a lawyer, but as a citizen, I'm very disturbed by this. And this is one of the issues that's brought me home from an international practice to start doing more of this work in Canada, along with other colleagues who are working with me in the Voices group. What's at stake is not only fundamental rights and liberties, but many of the basic institutional foundations on which our reputation for democratic governance stands. And I believe, sometimes hope should triumph over good sense, that conservatives and liberals, unionists, corporate captains, environmentalists, entrepreneurs, everyone should care about this. We need to reclaim advocacy, activism, and dissent as good words. Documenting what is happening, as Voices is trying to do, is a necessary beginning. We're still developing this narrative arc through Voices, and I would invite you to become part of both the narrative and that solution, not only in Voices, but in the organizations I know you're all involved with. So thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming out on a Friday afternoon, and I would welcome questions.